When I was in my junior year at George Fox University, I took an entry-level class in ethics. The professor of that class, Phil Smith, very quickly became one of my favorite professors at the university. His wisdom, thoughtfulness, and teaching style made learning ethics fun and made me think about things in a way that I never had before. Phil has been teaching ethics for over 40 years in varying capacities, and he currently teaches part-time at George Fox. He has written several books on ethics and virtues and has also written fiction books, which we'll be discussing later in the episode. I learned many lessons from that ethics class that have helped shape me into the person I am today. Now, over 10 years later, we'll be discussing many of those same topics in this episode. We'll be covering topics that may seem familiar on the surface, such as virtue, truth, hope, civility, faith, but I can nearly guarantee that you're going to learn something new. Hi, I'm Daniel Roberts, host of the Giving Town podcast, where we share stories about the people and organizations that make Newberg so great. This podcast is brought to you by my real estate team, the Joyful Roberts Group, where we help your family make the right move. If you're interested in learning more about our team's unique approach to helping families and specifically seniors, you can learn more about us at thejoyfulrobertsgroup.com. Well, thanks for tuning in to this episode, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Phil Smith. Phil, thanks for joining me on the Giving Town podcast. It's great to have you here.
I'm very glad to be here.
When I first asked if you were interested in doing a podcast interview with me, I remember you said, well, why would you have a semi-retired ethics professor at George Fox come on your podcast? So,
well, that's still a good question. Your podcast is, as I understand it from a distance, is to kind of promote Newberg and promote Newberg businesses and good things about Newberg. I'm just a retired guy. Not quite, and because of certain colleagues of mine, now please get that this is two-faced here. I complain in quotation marks about my colleagues who go out and apply for big grants and get them, and then they're not thinking about who's going to teach my class when I have to step away and do this research and writing. My colleagues should be more thoughtful of retired people who want to have their time free. So I'm back to teaching because I have very successful younger colleagues who do good work.
Well, the reason is, and maybe to clear up perception or perspective, whatever you call it, for other listeners too, is so I do have the Living in Newberg YouTube channel, which is all about Newberg businesses living here. But the podcast is focused on the people and organizations who help make Newberg great. And when I was a junior in college at George Fox, I took an ethics class from you. I think it was just Ethics 101. And it definitely shifted my worldview because there were a lot of things brought up that I hadn't considered before and things that I really needed to know. One of which I think we'll get into is fallibilism, which I wrote my final paper on.
Okay, good.
It really gave me a good dose of humility. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is specifically because you specialize in virtue ethics. Virtue theory,
yeah.
Right. And ethics and how we treat each other and civility, which is a huge thing in Newberg, which has been for a long time, but it seems to keep coming up that how do we deal with people we disagree with? And I've done this with a few other people on, with United as Neighbors and the discussion groups in town. But going to someone who's actually studied this their entire career and talking about how do we live together in a town where we disagree, and just kind of talking about some of these things. In addition to some of the books you've actually written on these topics, I just think I just thought it'd be cool to have you on the podcast and share a message that our town could really use.
So I hope that's true. I would very much hope that that's true.
So the first thing before we get into all of that, I want to get to know you a little bit. So you tell me a little bit about your story. I read a little bit. I cheated, looked online, but some of this about how you ended up at George Fox and why it was the only college you applied to and how you got into ethics.
Yeah, well, one time I described myself at a chapel at George Fox as a GFU lifer. I grew up going to a little Friends church in East Wenatchee, Washington. And once upon a time in the mid-'60s, they had a scripture memorization contest. And I was the winner among the boys and girls at our church. So our pastors, Robert and Lee Lamoral, took me to yearly meeting that summer, and we drove all the way to Newberg. It was very exciting. And I got to meet people here. I think I was 9 years old, maybe 10. And so I visited George Fox in the mid-'60s. And people who know the history of George Fox knows that it was a very small school, rapidly growing because of the leadership of Milo Ross. But rapidly growing, still only a few hundred students total. But I decided as a 9-year-old that I was going to go to George Fox, and that was the end of the story. I do not recommend this as a way to choose your college. Fast forward a few years, I'm in high school, I take the SAT, I score pretty well. I get lots of letters from universities across the country, really prestigious universities. It was good for my ego. And I just put them all in a shoebox because I was going to apply to George Fox. And that's the only school I ever applied to, and I was accepted. And so I often, after graduating high school, I spent the mid-'70s at George Fox. That's the first stage. 2 weeks after I graduated, I married another George Fox graduate. The students all go, and then we moved to Southern California. We went to seminary. My wife became a psychologist. I became a pastor. And so after 5 years, I was back at George Fox, pastoring in Portland and teaching part-time at George Fox.
Oh, okay.
So another joke. I've been teaching since 1982 at George Fox, except for 1 year. So this fall, I am entering my 42nd year of either full-time or adjunct teaching, which means I have 10 more years to go to catch Mary Sutton, who set the record for 52 years. That is a joke. I do not intend to adjunct for 10 more years. But it's almost mind-boggling to think that this woman taught at George Fox, tiny little George Fox, from 1910 to 1962. Wow. So that's a little bit of history at George Fox. I never met her, of course, because she retired in 1962. The story that I told you about coming as a little boy was in probably 1964 or something like that. So I've been teaching part-time or then full-time from 92 to 22, 30 years of full-time ever since, except for that 1 year that I did back in the 80s.
Okay. So how did you go from being a pastor to teaching as a professor?
Well, when I was an undergraduate, I took practically every course that Arthur Roberts had, and we were small enough we didn't have a theology degree. We had a philosophy theology degree or philosophy religion degree. So I was always aiming at being in work in the church or service to God in some way. I went to seminary. I was working as a pastor. A lot of my sermons were a lot like lectures. I was always interested in the intellectual side. And so I taught part-time at George Fox. And then I think it was 86, I think, Arthur asked me to teach a history of philosophy class, which I was not prepared for, but he was trying to run a department on a small budget. And so I spent the summer reading 5 volumes of the history of philosophy by W.T. Jones, and realized in reading that this was the direction I ought to go, back into philosophy. So in 87, I applied to the University of Oregon. Now, you have to kind of put yourself back into the history here. I'm applying to the University of Oregon having come out of a small Christian college and then having done seminary. They're looking at an applicant who comes out of a small Christian college and has done seminary. Both of us looking with a little bit of, let's say, doubt. They did not admit me. They said, no, you're not a student, but you can come and take a class.
Okay.
So I took a class. Turns out the first class I took at UO was ethical theory with William Davey. And after I wrote a 45-page term paper. I was overly active. You're not supposed to write 45-page term papers. They said, oh, well, you're in. So I had a very good relationship with the people at the University of Oregon. They treated me well. I got a Wittgensteinian approach to philosophy, and pretty soon I decided I want to work in ethical theory, and because of the influence of William Davey and what was going on in the late 20th century, I wanted to work in ethical theory. So I read a lot of Iris Murdoch and wrote my dissertation. And so now that kind of dates me. Yeah, that's 1991. That's old stuff now.
So you got your doctorates in
philosophy at the University of Oregon.
Okay, with a specialization. Was it at that time you specialized in virtue theory?
Yes. And my dissertation was called Learning to Love, Philosophy and Moral Progress. I drew heavily on Iris Murdoch. I had a chapter criticizing... I had a chapter called How Not to Think About Moral Progress. And this is some people will remember, because it was very famous, Kohlberg. The idea of moral stages. He took, and he did a lot of research in psychology, was very influential. Lawrence Kohlberg, I finally get the name that comes to mind, was very influential in the way people thought about moral progress. And I think thinking about moral growth and progress and how to become a full person is a great topic. But his approach to it was sequential, and the way it lined up, his stages of moral progression just line up with different philosophical theories, so that you end up being a Kantian in the end. And so, by this time, having been influenced by Murdoch and others, I actually have a chapter in my dissertation saying, "Don't do it this way." I'm very critical of these people.
Well, so take us back to maybe we're in middle school, because most people have never taken any type of class on ethics, which is sad. The fact that it was until I was at the end of college that I took an elective that was ethics. Most people have never experienced any of this. They don't know what Kantianism is. I can't even remember some of the other ones. And so they have no framework of ethics and virtue theory, or even what virtue is something good, right? And a vice is something bad. That's kind of the extent of what people know. So help us understand virtue theory and ethics from a very, very basic level.
Well,
and why it's important, why someone should even care.
Everybody cares about right and wrong. Now, there have been some on the margins of philosophy who will deny right and wrong. So when you teach a college level class, you actually have to deal with some of these marginal things, relativism of cultural relativism. And sometimes people are surprised that there are really good arguments for rejecting nonsense. So I'm not going to talk about that. Everybody cares about right and wrong, and there have been many philosophers who have given attention to this, because we all, once we get honest with ourselves, we want to live in a world where people treat each other well. And so you have different theories. Most Americans are familiar, whether they're familiar with the word or not, they're familiar with utilitarianism. Mm-hmm. The right thing is the thing that leads to the most happiness for the most people. That's utilitarianism. It's based on the idea that we all want happiness, and that's how you do it. Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest thinkers in the history of our tradition, our civilization, was outraged by this. The right thing cannot be, trying to calculate happiness. You have to do your duty as a rational being. Even if for a short period of time it doesn't lead to happiness, do your duty as a rational being. You may not lie on your loan applications. And this is his example, not my example. Even if you think you can get away with it in this particular case and everybody would be happy, you have to ask yourself, what would the world be like if everybody did this? Hmm. This is what Kant's called universalizing your maxims. Hmm. And very quickly it becomes obvious, you cannot will that everybody lie on his loan applications. If everybody lied on his loan applications, the banks wouldn't bother to print up loan applications because everybody lies. And the business of loaning would fall apart. Capitalism would be destroyed.
Kind of sounds like 2007.
Oh, well, yeah, there are.
And prior.
Well, and there are, I don't want to offend anybody, but there are politicians today who will say, yeah, I lied, but nobody got hurt, so it's okay.
A politician?
I'm not going to name it.
I was going to say, I think that's kind of the status quo. At least it sadly seems to be. So the right and wrong part and the utilitarianism, it's interesting because as you start going into these things, the things that we maybe take for granted, it's actually kind of more complicated. Well, who gets to say what's right and wrong, and how do you know?
Every society in the world has a rule against lying. Now, sometimes at a really simplistic, relativistic level, students are surprised by that. But I say, well, try to imagine a society where there is no expectation at all that you will tell the truth. And then I say, okay, and what time is it? And then they say, 4:30, because they want to get out of class. And I say, you're not very imaginative at all. You could say oranges. The fact is, if we didn't have an expectation of telling the truth, a moral expectation of telling the truth, human beings would only grunt at each other. This is how philosophers sitting in their offices can do mental experiments. They know that every culture in the history of the world has a moral rule against lying. Now, there will be exceptions to the rules, and all of the cultures will disagree about what are the proper exceptions. But the basic rule is tell the truth. Everybody has that rule.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of this term about rights. People talk about rights. These are rights, and these are rights. Well, and everyone disagrees about which rights are actually, the right to all kinds of things that people disagree on. So it's interesting. People feel so justified in this thing of rights, which is, there's the Bill of Rights, which, came up with the Founding Fathers,
but the Bill of Rights, even in our American documents, comes second to that wonderful preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, that's a philosophical move. Most Americans don't recognize that Jefferson is quoting Descartes. There are certain things that are self-evident. We don't even have to argue for these truths because we know these truths are self-evident. And then what are they? Men are created by God and given certain inalienable rights. So, part of our philosophical tradition says that people have rights. And then people ask, well, where do they come from? What's the basis of rights? And then the philosophers get busy and we have opposing views, opposing theories to try to explain these rights that we believe in. We do believe we have rights. And then in the American experiment, we say that we have rights in our Declaration, and then we enumerate what we think are some really important ones in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Well, do we have those rights because the Congress passed the first, second, third, fourth amendments, and then the states ratified them according to is that the reason they have rights? This would be, some people would call a positive view of rights. Rights are whatever we agree to by our governmental, and if the government hadn't agreed that we have a right to life, liberty, and property, then they didn't exist. Most people say, no. When we made law to recognize these rights, we were recognizing something that preceded the rights. Okay, if you're not going to be a positivist about rights, what's this mysterious preceding stuff? Well, some people point to what Jefferson wrote, God. Interestingly enough, Jefferson himself was quite skeptical about God, but he put it in there in the Declaration of Independence. Are our rights rooted in our created nature as creatures of God? Naturally, as a Christian, that's the direction I'm going to go. Or is it rooted in something else about human nature? And there are competing views among thinkers. So in an ethics course at a good university, I have to make sure students are aware of these differences. That I can't, sometimes people say, oh, you work at a Christian university, you must be, quote, indoctrinating people. No.
Yeah, not at all.
I want people to think for themselves and to recognize the problems. Do you believe in rights? Most of us do. What's the basis of those rights? And there's a real debate out there.
You did a very good job, and this was over 10 years ago, but you did a very good job at presenting the opposing opinions, letting us discuss it as students, and I never knew what you thought. And I don't know if I can guess at what you believe, but I thought you did a wonderful job at presenting the ideas and teaching us how to think about them. I even remember one example where you were talking about the whole idea of crime and punishment, and what if you could say someone commits a crime and say there's this magic machine that you could put them in, and the timing was completely random. They could be in there for a minute, or maybe it would take 30 years, but when they came out, they're...
Rehabilitation machine, right?
Right. And so we had people debate on either side of a table, and I remember debating on one side and realizing, wow, I think I'm actually completely wrong about this. And then I got on the other side of the table the next time around and was debating the other person. And so it was just very, I think a lot of times people get so ingrained in their way of thinking and never even stop to consider that there might be an extremely valid, maybe even more valid way of thinking than the way they think. And I think that's part of why I wanted to have you on as well, because it really helped me take a much more humble approach. And that's kind of what I want to get at is, as residents of Newberg and the surrounding area and anyone else who might listen to this, how do we take a humble approach to our deeply held beliefs and opinions, and how do we interact with people who may have very different opinions, even for things that we consider, self-evident rights that someone else completely disagrees with?
The first book, after my dissertation, the first book I wrote in philosophy was called, it's a terrible title, The Virtue of Civility in the Practice of Politics. I went to a philosopher's conference and listened to a paper from a very good philosopher named Robert Audi. Bob Audi is a Christian, but he's so well known and so respected. He is past president of the APA and also past president of the Society of Christian Philosophers. Terrific guy. And he was reading a paper about how we should, and he was giving rules for how we should debate one another in a civil society. And I was sitting there and I was thinking, he's giving rules, but he should be talking about the virtue involved here. And I realized the label I would put on this virtue is civility. This is because I have been doing things in terms of virtue theory, and here Bob Audi was doing something in terms of the rules of how to be a good citizen. So I actually had the temerity to criticize Bob's paper. And later, he was so generous, he talked with me about it. And then that led to one paper after another, and so I collected them into a little book called The Virtue of Civility in the Practice of Politics that was published in 2002. And I think the question is, I thought then and I still think now, the question is very important. How do we deal with each other in a liberal democracy where we disagree with each other? I think these questions are just as important in other political situations where you have authoritarians, and some countries in our world really are in a very different and hard place. But those of us who have the privilege of living in liberal democracies need to ask, how should we deal with the people that we disagree with? And the one-word answer is, we ought to be civil. So in writing of the book, I had to give a definition. So civility, I say, just to give a working definition, is the attitude, the heart attitude that wants to treat your political opponents well. I don't say anything about what it means to treat somebody well, because I think everybody knows that. If you are civil towards somebody, you won't lie about them. You won't threaten them. You will keep your agreements with them and so on. You'll treat them well. So then I turn to the question, what would motivate people to do this? I think it is necessary in a civil or in a liberal democracy to treat our political opponents well. If we don't, the downsides are pretty obvious. You get into politics as war, politics as personal destruction, of do anything to win. And unfortunately, we see it's too easy to find examples of those things. Unfortunately, historically, not unfortunately, but I think it's historically true that we Christians, because I count myself as a Christian philosopher, have many times have contributed to incivility. Historically speaking, the wars of religion of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, hundreds of years of wars, Catholics versus Protestants versus the Anabaptists got killed by everybody, led to a position that, we mentioned earlier how Jefferson uses nature's God, but he himself is skeptical. Jefferson is an example of what we will call an Enlightenment philosopher. The Enlightenment taught us how to be civil. My interpretation of history. It's one-sided. That in the 18th century, stepping away from the wars of religion, there was this idea, we can treat each other well because my neighbor is a rational being. Now, he may actually be a Protestant or a Catholic, or maybe even an atheist. He may be a Jew, but he's a human being. And so underneath it all, he's a rational being, and we can appeal to reason. Now, if that is true, to the degree that that thesis is true, that civility was made possible to us by the Enlightenment rationalism of the 18th century, I said in my book, published in 2002, we're in trouble because we're now living, and this is the big word in the 1990s, we're postmodernists now. We're not modernists anymore. We don't believe in universal reason anymore. Instead, you will find people who will say things like, so-and-so is a, fill in the blank, white, male, heterosexual, or a black, female, homosexual, or an Asian immigrant, and the point is, they don't think like us. They're not reasonable. There is no such thing as universal rationality. Therefore, we got to just fight for us. Imagine going, so this is the epic little imagination game that I have played with students. Imagine going to the National Abortion Rights Action League, the NARAL convention, and trying to give a speech against abortion. Try imagining going to the Right to Life conference and giving a speech in favor of abortion rights. We can't imagine it because both sides would shout the other down. They are evil. They are trying to destroy us, or they're trying to destroy innocent babies. I'm giving an example that is a very passionate, easy to see current example that illustrates what I think is the problem. And so I made a prediction back in 2002 that civility is in deep trouble in our culture, because if, to the degree it is a gift of the Enlightenment and we're postmodernists, people don't believe it anymore, and there's no good reason to treat your opponent well. That's scary, and it's really sad that I think my prediction has come true. It's merely 20-some years later, but I think our condition is even worse than it was.
So given that, and we see examples of this all the time, each individual still has to take it upon themselves to be virtuous, treat people with civility. Mm-hmm. Now, say in a political election, and this is for us extremely true also in local elections, mm-hmm. where you start out, I think both sides start out saying, hey, we're going to try to be civil and, let's do it this way. And then something comes out and whether it's an opponent themselves or one of their supporters says something about the other side that mm-hmm. may not be true, or maybe it is, but it's twisted. Mm-hmm. And now you have this thing circling around on social media. And so now this person is being painted in a negative light in the public. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, I could do the exact same thing. Right. And so then
we get tit for tat and,
you're right.
And we hammer each other.
And then what you said, the only, it's like, well, whatever it takes to win. How do you, in these kind of situations, how do you respond when the other side is, and everyone can say, well, the other side did it first or whatever, but how, whether you say it as from a, philosophical or Christian philosophy standpoint, or just someone who's like, hey, I just want to treat people well, mm-hmm. how should you respond knowing that, okay, if I treat this person civil, I may not win and give up the election. I mean, that's a tough choice to make.
I think we need to ask ourselves what the point of politics is. And so I'll give you maybe a strange definition of politics. Politics is the business of making group decisions. Now, that's a very broad definition, and that means, is there such a thing as office politics? Groups making decisions? Yeah, sure there is. We all know there's office. Is there university politics? Is there faculty politics? I'll tell you, yes, it is. Yes, there is. Are there family politics? If it's as simple as Sarah wants to go here for a vacation, I want to go here for a vacation, we've got to make a group decision. It's politics. Okay. Now, what's the goal of politics? I want to suggest, and so far I've never found anybody to disagree, the goal of politics is better decisions. We can make worse decisions or better decisions. If that's the goal of political process, then it's easy to understand that civility helps. Because when you have disagreements, I'm back to the easy case, when Sarah and I disagree about where we should go for a vacation, do we want to trash our relationship just so we can go to the place I want? Well, what fun is it to go there if I've won a fight by trashing Sarah? No. Many husbands have discovered it's better to go where she wants to go and be happy. And many wives have discovered the same thing, right? So,
you'll be happy if you go where I want to go.
Okay. Oh, yeah. A second fact that comes in play here, and this, when you move into business politics, it becomes really clear. The other guys in the office, the other women in the office, know stuff that I don't know. We want better decisions. So if they know stuff that I don't know, my political opponents are actually a resource to me. Because if we can get them to contribute their knowledge, we will make a better decision. And many managers in businesses of all sorts have discovered this. I've got these people disagreeing with these people, but I need them to hear each other. I need them to all sides contribute, because then we together will do better. So I entitled my book, The Virtue of Civility in the Practice of Politics. But I have a chapter in there about how business can train us in civility. We often think of the business world as being dark and full of, inter-office warfare or whatever. But I think many, many managers have recognized that may be what we fall into, but what we really want is cooperation. We want better decisions. And treating the political opponent well means we'll make a better decision now. And since we're still going to be in the office a year from now, it'll lead to better decisions next year. I think the same thing applies in all political situations, in families, in churches, in communities, if we treat the other, the political opponent, well, we preserve them, him, her, as a resource for better decision-making as we go along.
Yeah, this reminds me a lot of the very first episode I ever did back when this podcast was actually called the Elpis Project. And you might actually know, as far as Greek Elpis stands for hope. So, but most people don't know that. It was confusing, which is why I changed the name. But Bruce Arnold, who runs Home PDX up in Portland, we talked about humanizing the other, because often there's a tendency to dehumanize the other person. If you can first make them a bad person, then it's much easier to disagree with them because they're just a bad person and everything they do and say is wrong. And media does a very good job of presenting this as well. And we like the Hollywood movie where there's a bad guy and a good guy and the bad guy loses. And we have a tendency to treat our opponents that way. And it's a very boring movie and unsatisfying when you say, well, that's not a bad guy. And actually, if you begin to treat them well, then it complicates things and makes for a
You have to listen,
messy plot line.
You don't get neat, easy endings.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about all of this, though, is it's actually really hard to allow yourself to entertain the perspective of someone that you extremely passionately disagree with, and even take something like abortion rights, and both sides of that camp are extremely passionate and vilify the other side intensely. And it's very difficult if you're on one side or the other, because I've done this, of saying, well, what if they were right? And actually looking into maybe I'd be curious to hear your perspective on identifying the virtuous, what is behind their motivation here, and beginning to consider those things. And it's hard. It actually takes a toll on you. It can take a toll on your mental health, because you're challenging a core belief, and your body and your brain don't like that. Yeah. And that comes into this whole idea of fallibilism. And that's all connected, right? So can you share a bit on that?
Fallibilism is just the doctrine that we make mistakes, that we make errors. If you add that into the discussion about civility, it's really easy to see what happens. We want to make better decisions. I make mistakes. Now, of course, it's easy to say they make mistakes, but I make mistakes. And one of the best ways to catch my mistakes is to listen to the other who disagrees with me. If I make mistakes and I listen to the other, I might learn something. I might get closer to the truth, and we as a group could get closer to the truth. Now, I mentioned before in the history, my take on the history of civility is that it was kind of a gift of the Enlightenment. No matter how weird your opponent is, underneath it all, they are a rational being, or he or she is a rational being. And unfortunately, I think in a postmodern age, a lot of people say, well, underneath it all, they're just bigots, or they're just evil. So here I personally turn to something that I think many of your listeners in the Newberg area will agree with, but we need to take very carefully. Think very seriously and think carefully about it. Underneath it all, my political opponent is created by and loved by God. God did not make this person exactly like me. But God made this person and loves this person. And for that reason, even if I don't believe the Enlightenment story, I need to listen to this person. I need to care about this person. This is where civility, an argument for civility can be made even if you're not a fallibilist. A fallibilist believes I sometimes make mistakes. Now, all of us will admit that we sometimes make mistakes, but some people say, I make mistakes, but I don't make mistakes about this, and this. I know this is true. And the non-fallibilists that I'm concerned about are Christian non-fallibilists, and I am with them in that we think certain things are true. And so that's why I want to point to the things that we think are true that God made our enemies. God loves our, notice I use the very strong word enemy. I'm not our political opponent. And too often we do think of political opponents as enemies. God loves them. In reality, God gives them to us as a gift so that we can learn from the people we disagree with, so that we can make better decisions.
You wrote a couple other books, and I don't know if we're going to have time to get into everything, because I feel like I'd probably have a 3-hour conversation with you about all of this. But I want to talk at least briefly about two of the other ones. So the next one I want to talk about is why faith is a virtue. And on this topic of God and Christianity, some listeners believe in God, and many probably don't. Mm-hmm. And people think about faith, they think about often a religious faith. Mm-hmm. And I, full disclosure, have not read the book. I know a little bit about it. But can you share what drove you to write that book? Who's the audience? What's the point you're making with that?
I'm a Christian philosopher. There are many non-Christian philosophers. And so I had the opportunity to go up to visit Peter Boghossian's atheism course, very popular. When he was a professor at Portland State, Peter has since lost his job there. And there's academic controversy about that. But Peter's an outspoken atheist. And he would say, faith is a cognitive sickness. So we had strong disagreements. And so knowing that there are people who say that faith is a bad idea, and now Peter is somebody I got to know, and he's local in the Oregon area. But in the turn of this new century, in the first 20 years of this new century, there are very influential, is it possible to talk about big name philosopher? Hitchens and Dawkins and these guys who for several years, for a good decade, were really effectively preaching in the media that it's time to get over theism. And, the whole God idea is a bad idea. So there were these voices out there. And because I got to know Peter and interacted with him, I set to work. I was finished with the book on civility. I thought, I'm going to write a book on faith and why faith is a virtue. And so I drew on some of the literature and give a definition of what faith is. Faith is believing certain things that other people for whom you have intellectual respect, don't believe. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the heart of it. And then the argument is, if you have this kind of belief in things that other people don't believe, it will lead to good results in your life. Scientifically, politically, and in family life. My first wife, Karen, said, you need to give specific examples. So some of the strengths of the book are extended examples of scientists whose research program was wedded not to religious faith, but to faith.
So how do you define faith, by the way?
Well, believing things that people for whom you have intellectual respect do not believe.
Okay.
And this put me into shape my life later, because I said, okay, I've got to go do some research and find examples. Most people don't know much about Henrietta Leavitt. Henrietta Leavitt was, her official title was computer at Harvard in the turn of the 20th century, 1900 to 1920. They never let her use a telescope because she was a woman. She was a computer, but they let her see pictures. astrophotography was in its infancy. And so they took pictures of the sky from big telescopes. And she was particularly interested in the pictures on glass plates. Harvard still has thousands and thousands of glass plates of negatives and positives. And she discovered many, many Cepheids. Cepheids are oscillating stars. And because she was looking and looking and looking, she discovered what's called the PL relationship, the period luminosity relationship, and she proved it. I mean, just by tons of evidence. She is the one who discovered how to measure the distances to the stars.
Wow.
Because of the PL relationship. Later, some guy in Southern California used this to say, we call him Hubble. He discovered that the universe is getting bigger, but Henrietta discovered it. And because she believed that she could do it. Her faith wasn't so much in a theory, it was in that persistence would pay off. And it did.
So how would you compare that? I mean, that's a verifiable example that, hey, sometimes this does work. But how do you know it's not confirmation bias and that there actually is, even to the extent of maybe religious faith, that how can you say it's actually a virtue, not that it just sometimes works?
Well, yeah. The book has a chapter on, I'll go blank on the word here, credulity. If faith is a virtue, what about credulity? Believing things the wonderful line from Alice in Wonderland. Alice says, you can't believe things that are impossible. But the White Queen says, oh, no, you haven't tried very hard. I myself believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. Credulity, believing things that are impossible, believing things that are against the evidence, is that faith? I'm not arguing that is faith, but I'm arguing that believing things that are some things that are questionable, that people, see that part that I put in? It's to believe something that other people for whom you have intellectual respect, don't believe. That means you automatically have a reason to doubt the thing that you believe. People who say that faith means having no doubts are not talking about the same thing I am. Because if I believe something that I know Peter doesn't believe, and he's a smart philosopher, and we've had these discussions, the very fact that Peter doesn't believe gives me a reason to doubt. That's just true. So faith usually, not always, but usually coexists with doubts. And yet, I give examples in scientific practice and in political practice and in family life that believing in things that other people don't believe can lead to really good results.
It makes me think too, I think faith goes even farther, if you put it that way, than we might care to admit, because faith can really encompass anything that is not absolutely scientifically proven. 2 + 2 is 4. That doesn't take any faith. But scientific theories and hypotheses that have to be tested, that there's not enough evidence for, but that you believe it's true, even the staunchest atheists would have to agree with that.
Are you committed to a research paradigm when you know there are other researchers working on a different research paradigm? And this is, according to standard history of philosophy, history of science, we know that this exists. Practicing scientists know that those guys over there are pursuing a different way of understanding it, and we might be wrong. So they have to have some doubts. And yet, they have to believe in their theory enough to spend years of their lives and millions of dollars of their grant. I'm assuming this is a top-rated scientific investigation. They've got big bucks invested. You're spending a lot of time and money and human energy on something when you know that there are really smart people who disagree with you. But if you don't do it, if we were to stop because the others disagree with us, we wouldn't make that progress. Now that's in science. But the same thing holds in family life. What do you say about the life of an interracial couple in New York City in the 1950s? Lots of people say this is a wrong thing to do. But we believe we can raise our kids to be good citizens and love God. That takes faith to hold to something that other people openly criticize and condemn, and hold to it so that you can achieve something good. There's a particular book that I can't blanking on the title, so I won't try to give the author there.
The next book, and I think I have the orders, and you wrote them out of order, but they tie in together. And the next one is on understanding hope. Now, this one actually goes into my understanding is your personal life and how you personally found hope in the middle of some really hard stuff.
Right. I mentioned debating vacation with Sarah, my current wife. Karen, my wife of 39 years, died in 2016. In 2015 and 16, I had finished the faith book, and I was working on hope. And so here I'm working and reading material and philosophy on hope and trying to understand what hope is. Meanwhile, I'm also writing in my journal about the weekly process of my wife dying of cancer. So actually, when I finished the book on hope, I have an appendix. I call it The Last Walk. It's a series of essays that I wrote in 2016 and then on after she had died in 2017. So it's a personal what's the right word here? Experience of hope in the midst of loss. We lose all kinds of things in this life. We lose our spouses, we lose our businesses, we lose our dreams of, dreams of being a professional football player. People lose things. How do we maintain hope in a world where there is real loss? I'm particularly interested as a Christian philosopher in Christian hope and the idea of resurrection, that even death does not bring a final end to our hopes. In understanding hope, I leaned a lot on the work of a philosopher, how we hope. She said, it's not just what hope is. I mean, since the medieval world, the basic definition of hope is to desire something that is possible, not certain. When I'm sitting and eating Thanksgiving dinner, I don't hope to eat Thanksgiving dinner because I already have it. I don't hope to have dinner with Karen today because she's dead, has been dead for some years. That's just a wish. So it has to be something that is possible that I desire. Well, that's a pretty thin definition of hope. So how do we hope? How do we focus our minds and our feelings and our imaginations on hope? Some of the good literature that I tried to get into in the book takes this practical question, how to hope? And then, as I said, it had a very particular personal meaning to me because I was writing this and trying to understand hope in the year before and then the years after I had this loss. Losses are real. So those are the philosophy books I've written. Civility and Hope and faith. My dissertation was on love, but it didn't get published, so you can't get that.
I want to stick on the topic of hope for a bit, and let me actually just check the time where we're at here. I'll talk for a few more minutes on it. Okay. This podcast, the subtitle is Sharing Stories of Hope and Generosity, and hope is something I think is very important, especially because if you don't have hope, you stop contributing any good to society, because what difference does it matter anyway? And I think hope is very important on a societal level and on a personal level, because if you give up hope, then why continue living?
Consider a simple illustration that I had in one chapter in the book. Some guy is out, who knows why, in November in some northern state looking for a Christmas tree. And he goes off onto a logging road, and he slides off the road and crashes his pickup. And he gets out, and then he stumbles into the creek, and he's all wet. And he realizes he's in deep trouble. His pickup won't run, and it's getting dark. What does it mean to hope? Well, he thinks maybe somebody will come by. And he clings to that idea. And it's easy to imagine somebody who gives up hope and dies because it's late November and it's cold and he's icy, or somebody who continues to hope and he lives. Does hope guarantee the thing you're hoping for? No, it doesn't. But it helps us get to the things we're hoping for. How does he hope? He imagines somebody coming by. He might actually do something to try to signal a person if they come by. Sometimes when we hope, we can't actually do things. The hope is entirely internal. And yet I think it is better to hope and keep trying to the degree that you can than to just give in. Does that help at all?
There's some really interesting theories out there that, even getting down into quantum theory and quantum physics, that I don't understand, but even people who maybe would consider themselves atheists or at least agnostic talk about this idea of how you think and how you imagine, and that the thoughts going on in our brains are actually, and I don't know anything about quantum physics or how that relates to me. I'm like, you're having to use a lot of faith on those principles there. But it's very interesting that the way we think and the way we shape our perspective, and hope, people talk about affirmations, and that, there's this thing called, the attraction theory, where if you set something in your mind, then it's more likely to come about, which there's a lot of interesting examples of that, which again, I don't know how much of that's confirmation bias versus there's some truth in it. But that's really related to hope. And so I think there's this, it's easier to give up hope because it's hard to hope sometimes. Mm-hmm. And it just is easier to just allow yourself to have a pity party. And you had to experience that, right? I mean, you had to come face to face with that.
Yes. And I don't want to suggest that it's easy. Karen died almost 8 years ago. And I've been remarried for almost 6 years. That doesn't mean it's all in the past. I still deal with longing for the person that I lost. And Sarah, her husband died almost 15 years ago. But she's still, it's like an amputation, not like a disease when you lose your spouse. There's something permanent about it. You can recover, you can go on, you can do well, you can fall in love, you can marry a new spouse, but the loss is real. Yeah.
So what about the hope side?
Well, now this is going to sound too flippant. I told Sarah, well, I look forward to meeting Lauren someday. Lauren is her husband who died 15 years ago. If you believe in resurrection and life after death, Isn't that a great thing to hope for? That he and I could have conversations, and we would be very kind, of course, about what we say about Sarah. But and think about other people that I've lost. You know, at my stage in life, many of the most important people in my life are now dead. I would like to see them. As some of the important people in my life I have never met because they were medieval philosophers who died a long time ago. Wouldn't it be fun to sit down with Alcuin or Anselm or Aquinas? That's a hope. And why not? It's possible, and I want it. That meets the basic definition of a hope. It's not impossible, as my friend Peter would say. It's impossible. These people are dead. They're gone. They don't exist anymore. Well, he and I have differing estimates of what possibility is. It's possible, since God exists and Jesus was raised from the dead, he can raise us too. And Alcuin and Anselm and Aquinas, they will have long lists of people who want to talk to them, but eventually I'll get my time.
You got a long time doing it.
I can wait. I can talk with Lauren for a while.
There's an interesting verse in the Bible, in the book of Hebrews. It talks about faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Now, what is the relationship between faith and hope as you see it? That verse is thrown around a lot. It's always been confusing to me.
Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. I don't know. In a philosophy book, I define faith as believing things and being for them that other people for whom you have intellectual respect, don't believe. So I have faith in the resurrection. Peter, who I have intellectual respect for, does not believe in that. So the faith and the hope go together. I believe it's possible because God exists. I believe there's God. And it gives me hope because it means what I want to happen may really happen. Now, some people say, oh, no, that's not a hope because we know for sure. I think they have a wrong understanding of faith and hope because there's a certain, excitement to living on the edge. There is some doubt involved. Maybe the materialists are all true and life just ends when I die. I don't think so, and I certainly don't hope so. I hope that they're wrong, and I'm looking forward to and that's important at my stage of life, to be able to say, I'm looking forward to this. Aristotle had a quip that hope was for young men and memories were for old men. And naturalistically speaking, it describes, 25-year-olds I'm going to have this wonderful career. People my age say, my career is kind of over and I can remember stuff. But many Christian philosophers have responded to Aristotle by saying, but in light of the gospel, we're all young men. We all get to look forward to something.
Well, it helps me a lot to know that even though you've written books on faith and hope, your first response is, well, I don't know. It's an interesting journey we all have to discover, I guess.
That's right. We claim knowledge too many times. We claim certainty too many times.
Well, the last question, given your involvement in Newberg for a long time, you've written a book on hope. What gives you hope for the future of Newberg?
I think if people step back from national politics and influencers, and if people step back and say, what do I want from my town? We would all agree. We want better decisions. We're not going to get perfection, whatever that is. We're going to get better decisions. And the way to get better decisions is to use all of our resources. Don't take a big part of our resources and just say, they disagree with me, so we're not going to count them. No, these are human beings. The Enlightenment says they're rational beings. As a Christian, I say they're created by God. They're human beings and they have much to contribute. Let's work together. Let's listen to them. I don't have to be persuaded by everything they say. They don't have to be persuaded by everything I say. But by working together, we can do better. And I think that gives me great hope, because I think most people in Newberg would say, yeah, let's do that. Let's work together. Let's do better. I served, I live in Dundee now, but I lived in Newberg for many years. And I was on the planning commission of Newberg for at least 16 years, I think. And almost uniformly, people want to work. That's been my experience. People want to work together. They may come to the planning commission with, oh, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. But when we listen to each other, we can find a way to sort it out. And I really appreciate the rules of Oregon public meetings, that we have to listen to each other. We have to give everybody a chance. I appreciate that.
Well, Phil, thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking to you. And it's hard to boil down an entire semester for me into one podcast or multiple books. We didn't even get to talking about the fiction books you're writing and where people can find those, which... where people can go on Amazon and find.
Yeah, I checked today. All of my philosophy books are available. That is, the ones that we've mentioned are available on Amazon.com. So they sell everything.
And if people want to learn about your fiction books, which I know we didn't get to.
Well, I'm self-publishing a very long science fiction story in 3 volumes. So I'm working on the second volume right now. It's called Castles. And you can go on, I bet you, I didn't check, but I bet you could find Castles Volume 1 on Amazon, or Kindle Direct Publishing. You could go there and they have it for sure.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and sharing some of your 40 years of experience with us. I think it's great things for all of us to think about and apply to our lives.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Givingtown podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend who you think might benefit from hearing it. While more and more people are continuing to hear about this podcast, I still need your help to spread the message about all the people and organizations that make Newberg so great. Well, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next episode.